Hey there. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. So we've gotten a ton of messages about this, so it seems like a lot of you are really interested in election betting markets.
Oh, yeah.
So we decided to, well, dive in. It's basically like polls, but with real money on the line.
Absolutely.
So we're going to try to figure out, are these markets just like, a gambler's paradise?
Yeah.
Or can they actually tell us something real about who's going to win, like the upcoming Trump versus Harris election?
Right.
And get this, some of these markets are seeing billions, like with a B, billions of dollars in bets.
Wow.
So to help us unpack all of this, we've got our resident expert
Hi there.
who's been looking into this for years.
Yeah, I've always found these markets fascinating. One of the things that I think is really cool is that they're not new.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Election betting markets have been around for centuries.
No, I totally thought this was like some new internet thing.
Nope. People have been wagering on elections going way back.
Like how far back?
I mean, think 16th century. People were betting on who would be the next pope.
Wow.
And we even saw betting on U.S. elections back in George Washington's time.
That's crazy.
It's pretty amazing how long this has been going on.
So if it's been around for so long, why did it kind of like disappear for a while?
Well, in the 1930s, polling came along and kind of took over.
Makes sense.
Yeah, newspapers started relying on those poll numbers instead of what the gamblers were saying.
Like it was the new scientific way to predict elections.
Exactly. But then, you guessed it, the internet brought election betting back with a vengeance.
The internet really does change everything, huh?
For sure. And now we've got all these websites like Predict It, Polymarket, Kalshi,
I've heard of those.
where you can bet on, everything. Who controls Congress, local mayoral races, you name it.
So it's back and it's like bigger than ever.
Definitely.
But it also sounds like things are kind of messy with regulations.
Oh, yeah.
Like, is the government cool with all this?
Well, the U.S. government, specifically the CFTC, is definitely wary.
The CFTC.
Commodity Futures Trading Commission.
Okay.
They're, worried about manipulation.
I could see why they'd be worried about that.
People trying to influence the election.
Right.
For profit, even just influencing how people vote. It's a bit of a gray area right now.
So like the Wild West of election prediction.
Pretty much. But even with all that uncertainty, these markets are just exploding in popularity.
So it seems like they're here to stay.
I think so.
But the big question is, are they more accurate than polls?
That's what we're going to try to figure out.
Like, is this just gambling, or are we looking at the future of political forecasting?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer might surprise you.
Ooh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, research suggests that they can be surprisingly accurate.
Really?
Yeah.
More accurate than polls?
Sometimes, yeah. There was this study, they looked at historical betting markets, like before scientific polling even existed. And guess what? The market predicted the winner correctly almost every single time.
Wow. Okay, I'm listening.
It's pretty wild. And it kind of makes sense, right? People put their money where their mouth is. They have skin in the game.
Yeah, there are actual consequences if they get it wrong.
Exactly. Plus, these markets react instantly to new information, something that traditional polls just can't do.
So, like, if there's a big scandal,
Exactly.
the betting markets change right away.
Instantly. While polls might take days, even weeks, to catch up.
So it's like having this, like, up-to-the-minute pulse on what people are thinking?
Exactly.
Okay, so let's bring this to the election everyone's talking about. Trump versus Harris.
All right.
What are these betting markets saying? Who's going to win?
Well, right now, it's a total nail-biter.
Right.
Polymarket, which is like the biggest player in this game, has it as basically a dead heat. The odds are almost perfectly even.
Wow, that's crazy.
And the amount of money being bet, through the roof, we're talking billions of dollars.
Billions on a dead heat.
Yeah. It's insane. It really shows you just how divided and uncertain people are.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So with all this money flowing into these markets, do you think this could be like a threat to traditional media? Like, what if people start getting their political insights from these markets instead of news channels or newspapers?
I think it's a real possibility.
Really?
Yeah, if people can get clear, unbiased information from these markets, why would they need to rely on news pundits with their own agendas?
So you're saying these markets could disrupt the whole way we consume news and political analysis?
It's definitely possible. Think about it. A market doesn't spin the numbers.
Yeah.
It just gives you the cold, hard facts based on what everyone's thinking, what everyone's betting on.
That's a really interesting point.
As like this alternative to the whole media narrative, you know?
Yeah, I see what you mean. This is all super fascinating, but we've got a lot more to cover.
Absolutely. There's so much more to unpack here.
We're going to dive even deeper into these markets and their potential impact after the break. So don't go anywhere.
So much to talk about. You know, looking at all the messages you all sent in, it seems like a lot of people are especially interested in this idea that these markets could actually be more accurate than polls.
Oh, for sure. That's what really caught my eye, too. Like, it's kind of mind-blowing, right, to think that these markets where people are putting their own money down could be better at predicting elections than, all those fancy polls we see everywhere.
Yeah. And, your intuition's not wrong. There's a whole lot of research out there that actually suggests these markets can be, well, eerily accurate, sometimes even more so than those traditional polls.
It's funny you should say that because I was just thinking about that study we mentioned earlier, the one that looked at those historical betting markets, like way back.
Well, yeah, the one where they predicted the winner, like almost every time, before we even had scientific polling.
Yeah, that one. It's wild.
It is. That study was actually done by these economists, Rode and Strumpf, I think their names were. They looked at election betting data going all the way back to the 19th century. And what they found was, well, astonishing, really. These markets were consistently more accurate than any other forecasting method they had back then.
Incredible. But, why? What makes them so good at predicting winners? Is it just, the money thing? Or is there something else going on?
It's not just the money, though, that definitely plays a role. Think of it this way. These markets, they kind of tap into this, what they call the wisdom of the crowd, They're pulling in information from all these different participants, each with their own perspectives, their biases, their motivations, all of that.
So it's almost like a giant brainstorming session where everyone brings their own piece of the puzzle.
Exactly.
And somehow, collectively, they end up with this picture that's more accurate than any one person could come up with on their own.
That's a great way to put it. And since everyone involved has this financial incentive to get it right, they're going to do their homework. They're going to be researching, analyzing the trends, adjusting their bets as new information comes out.
It's like this constantly self-correcting system, always refining itself.
Exactly. And unlike polls, which, let's be honest, can be skewed by things like sampling bias or even just how the questions are worded, these markets, they're a little less susceptible to those kind of distortions. They're purely driven by, well, the judgment of the people participating.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about manipulation? I mean, couldn't someone with a ton of money come in and, try to rig the whole thing?
That's a question that comes up all the time, and it's a good one. But, people who support these markets, they argue that manipulation is actually a lot harder to pull off than you might think.
Really? Why is that?
Well, first of all, these markets, they're incredibly dynamic. There's so much money flowing in and out all the time. It would be really, really difficult for any one person or even a group of people to really have a big impact on the overall odds.
So it's kind of like trying to manipulate the stock market. You might be able to make a little splash, but changing the whole tide, that's a whole other story, right?
Exactly. And here's the really interesting part. There's this built-in counterbalance to these markets, this natural one. So if someone tries to manipulate the odds, let's say they place a huge bet on something that's super unlikely, well, other people are going to see that as an opportunity, right? And they're going to bet against them. And that's going to drive the price back to something that's closer to the real probability.
So it's like this constant tug of war with the wisdom of the crowd kind of pushing back against any attempts to mess with the system.
Exactly. Plus, manipulating these markets, it's illegal. Platforms like Polymarket and Predictit, they all have, all sorts of security measures to try and detect and prevent that kind of stuff. And, you've got regulators like the CFTC watching things closely.
So there are safeguards in place.
For sure. The risk is never going to go away entirely, but it's all about weighing that risk against the potential benefits, right?
Yeah, I see that.
The accuracy, the transparency, those real-time insights, those are all pretty powerful.
I'm starting to get it. But, okay, let's zoom out for a second. For people like me who aren't, planning on actually betting on these elections, how can we use the information that comes out of these markets to, understand what's going on in politics, what the potential outcomes might be?
That's a great question. And that's actually one of the coolest things about these markets, I think. It's this ability to give us this constant stream of insights, real-time insights into public sentiment. It's almost like having this live feed of what everyone's thinking,
Yep.
watching how people are reacting to events as they're unfolding, you know?
Okay, yeah, that's a powerful image. So it's kind of like having your finger on the pulse of the electorate. Like you can literally track their moods, their reactions as things change.
Exactly. And unlike those traditional polls, which really only give you a snapshot in time, these markets, they're constantly updating, reflecting how public opinion is ebbing and flowing.
Okay, so it's like it's really dynamic. So can you give us some like concrete examples of how this real-time information can be, actually useful?
Sure, imagine like a bombshell news story drops, right? Something that could really shake up a candidate's chances. Well, by watching how the odds in these betting markets react, you can kind of get a sense of how is the public interpreting this news? Is this something that's going to have a real lasting impact?
So it's like it's a gauge for how important something actually is. Like you can tell if it's just a, blip on the radar or a potential game changer.
That's it. And that real-time feedback loop, it can be incredibly valuable for, political analysts, people who work on campaigns, even just regular folks who are trying to make sense of, the political landscape.
It's like having this insider information, seeing how people are really feeling, how they're reacting.
Yeah, and, beyond just tracking the immediate impact of events, these markets can also be used to track how individual candidates are performing over time.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Sure. So if you look at the historical data from these markets, you can see how a candidate's odds have gone up or down in response to, different speeches they've given, debates, policy endorsements, even, gaffes or scandals. It's almost like a performance review, but instead of a boss, it's the market that's doing the judging.
So it's like a whole team of analysts constantly crunching numbers, giving you feedback on every single move a candidate makes.
Exactly. And that data-driven approach, it can be really valuable for understanding what a candidate's strengths are, what their weaknesses are, seeing what really resonates with voters.
It's like a cheat sheet for understanding the electorate.
Yeah.
But, okay, isn't there a danger in, like, relying too much on these markets? Couldn't they end up distorting, the whole democratic process?
That's a really good point, and it's something that critics of these markets bring up a lot. They argue that if we let these markets become like the ultimate source of truth when it comes to predicting elections, we risk, reducing these really complex issues to just simple bets.
So instead of having, like, real discussions and considering different sides of an issue, we just follow the money.
That's the concern. And, it's important to remember that these markets, they're not perfect. They're just one tool, one of many that we can use to try and understand the complexities of politics.
So it's about, like, using them responsibly, recognizing what they're good at, but also their limitations.
Absolutely. It's about finding that balance, leveraging the insights they can provide without letting them, dictate our opinions or undermine the importance of critical thinking and real debate.
It sounds like it's kind of a tightrope walk.
It is.
But let's bring this back to the media for a second. You were saying earlier that some experts see these markets as a potential threat to, traditional news outlets.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a bit more? Like, what do they mean by that?
Sure. Well, one of the biggest arguments in favor of these markets is that they provide this more direct, more unbiased source of information compared to, traditional media, which often has its own agenda, its own biases.
Oh, it's like you're cutting out the middleman, going straight to the source.
Exactly. Supporters of these markets, they argue that you're getting a more accurate, more objective view of public sentiment by tapping into that wisdom of the crowd instead of relying on any single news organization or pundit.
That's a pretty strong argument, especially these days when it seems like trust in traditional news is, kind of going down the drain.
Yeah, exactly. But how exactly do these markets challenge the role of media? Well, for starters, they offer those real-time insights that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, the ones that traditional media often struggles to keep up with.
That's right. Remember that example we talked about with, tracking the impact of a major news story?
The one where betting markets could show us how important something really is, even before polls or news analysis can catch up.
Exactly. That speed, that responsiveness, it can give people who are participating in these markets a real advantage in understanding what's going on in politics. It's like having access to this constantly updating news feed that's being powered by the collective intelligence of all these people, as opposed to waiting for, a curated and often delayed report from a news organization.
It's like having a crystal ball that gives you a glimpse into what's going to happen in the race. But, okay, beyond just speed, How else do these markets challenge the traditional media?
Well, they also offer this level of detail, this granularity of information that traditional media often just can't match. So let's say you're interested in, a specific congressional race or how a particular candidate's doing in a certain state. Well, these markets often have bets that are tailored to those very specific outcomes, giving you this level of detail that you just might not find in, mainstream news coverage.
So it's like having this hyper-personalized news feed that's zeroed in on exactly what you're interested in.
Exactly. And that ability to really drill down into the details, it can be really valuable for anyone who wants to go beyond just the surface level and really understand, the nuances of a campaign.
It's like having your own personal team of political analysts. Wow, it's amazing to think about how these markets could really change the way we think about politics, how we consume information about it.
It really is.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to think about. But, I mean, let's be real. Not everyone's going to be, running to place bets on these elections. Some people are going to be hesitant, maybe even have some, ethical concerns about the whole thing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest concerns I hear is, well, this ethical question of, profiting from politics. Some people, they just find it morally wrong. They argue it trivializes democracy, turns elections into, just another game.
It's like we're turning politics into a casino.
Yeah. And that kind of detaches us from, the real consequences of these decisions,
Yeah,
right?
I get that. Critics worry it could lead to, more apathy, more cynicism, and that could undermine, that sense of civic duty that we need in a democracy.
Exactly.
Are there any other ethical dilemmas that people bring up?
Another big worry is, this potential for these markets to just make existing inequalities in our political system even worse. The critics argue that people who already have more wealth, more resources, they're going to have this unfair advantage in these markets. They can influence the odds, and that just tilts the playing field even more in their favor.
So it's the whole money talks problem. But in this case, it could actually be shaping how the public sees things, maybe even swaying election outcomes.
That's a big fear, yeah. It raises all these questions about fairness, about equal representation, things that are really fundamental to a democracy.
Yeah, those are some serious things to consider. It seems like we're still kind of figuring out where these markets fit in the bigger picture.
Yeah.
So to wrap things up, what does all this mean for, someone like me, someone who's just trying to understand politics, to make sense of it all?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think the most important thing is to approach these markets with a good balance of curiosity and caution, They can offer this really fascinating new way to look at politics, but it's important to be aware of their limitations, their potential downsides.
So it's not about blindly embracing them or rejecting them.
Right.
But more about understanding them, using them responsibly.
They're a tool, right? And like any tool, they can be used for good or bad. It's up to us to have these honest conversations about, what role they should play in our democracy, to weigh the benefits against the risks.
It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to engage with these new technologies, to shape how they develop in a way that aligns with our values. Well, I got to say, this deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. I came in pretty skeptical, but I'm leaving with a much better understanding of these markets and what they could mean for the future.
I'm glad to hear that. It's always a fascinating topic to discuss.
And to you, our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you, some things to think about as well. As these markets keep evolving, keep an eye on them, not necessarily to, place bets yourself, but to gain some insights into the trends, the uncertainties, the collective wisdom, maybe even the folly of the crowd.
They offer this unique and evolving perspective on the world of politics, one that can complement traditional sources of information and really deepen your understanding of how things work.
It's like having an extra tool in your political analysis toolkit,
Yeah.
A new way to decode the often confusing world of elections.
Exactly.
So as always, stay curious, stay informed, keep those thinking caps on.
Then thanks for joining us
For this deep dive into the world of election betting markets. Until next time, keep exploring.